Steven, do you think this camera outshines the R1, the so-called flagship? Jared Polin, FroKnowsPhoto.com, and this is a preview of the Canon R5 Mark II. Now, if you came here looking for the preview of the R1, that is out right now as well. It is linked down below. I highly suggest you watch both of these videos back to back to learn all of the information about these two massive cameras that Canon just put out. But this video is about the R5 Mark II. So where did I go to test out this camera? Well, Canon took me out to Phoenix, Arizona, where it was lovely 106 degrees. Not my ideal place to go test a camera indoors, but that's where they took us, and we only had a matter of hours to test two cameras, so we didn't get to go through everything or shoot as many examples or samples as we would normally like, but that's why this is a preview, and we also were using pre-production cameras, so it's not a full production camera just yet, though I was able to open the raw files from the R5 Mark II. So what did I shoot? Well, I shot something called futsal, which is like mini indoor soccer, basketball with a really good Japanese travel team. Those kids were really good at basketball, and I got some golf photos to test out the readout speeds of this sensor versus the R1 to see how well it actually does. Now, one thing to keep in mind, Steven was not there with me this time around as he was on vacation, so there won't be as much B-roll footage of me holding and using the camera. The footage that you will see was either from some of the other people that shot it of me, or you have my 360 camera and my Go 3S on my forehead. Now, as always, we like to record the electronic viewfinder from the camera so that we can take you inside it so you can see how everything is working to help you make your mind up. So throughout the video, you will see those EVF clips. Now let's start with the outside of the body. The R5 Mark II is very similar to that of the original R5. The front of the camera and the back of the camera are basically the same. The top down of the camera, though, has changed slightly. It's very similar to what you found in the R6 Mark II. So now the on and off switch has moved over to the right side, and the video switch to photo switch is on the left side. So anybody that's going from an R5 to an R5 Mark II, you're absolutely gonna hit the wrong thing for on and off just for a little bit until you get used to where the new switches have moved. One thing that has changed is this camera has bulked up just a little bit. It is slightly thicker than the older version because it has built-in vents. Yep, there are vents on the bottom of this camera. Canon has learned from the original R5 that did overheat very quickly, but did get much better once they updated the firmware. We're still using the R5s here in the studio because they work incredibly well, and with that firmware update, we haven't run into any overheating since. But to counter that, they now redid the body so there are vents on the side. Now there's no fan built in like you have in the R5C, but you can get a vertical grip that just does fan mode, meaning it has a fan and it sucks that air out and it cycles it through, and that's all that grip does. There's no buttons on it. But unlike when Nikon came out with the Z6 original that didn't have a vertical grip that actually had buttons and it was just a battery grip, there are two other grips available that do have buttons, and one of them is Ethernet capable for people who are in wire services and need to plug in to the Ethernet. Now, in terms of battery, they're still using the LPE6 shaped battery, but this time it gets a P delineation at the very end of it, and basically what you're getting from that is a higher discharge for power. It's the same size as before, so your older batteries would still work in this camera. Now, in terms of the electronic viewfinder, you now have a massive 5.9 million dot blackout-free EVF that has the anti-fogging, which is very similar to what you found in the R1 to have anti-fog. And it does now have room to include the eye control version 2. Now, this is a larger EVF than the R5. You can see by far it is much larger, and a lot of that has to do with housing that eye control version 2. But it is big, it is bright, it is beautiful. Now, from someone who's used the R1 is top of the line EVF. This is fine. I think the R1's always going to be better in this case, but most people are going to be very happy with this electronic viewfinder because of how big and bright and good it is. Now, in terms of the LCD screen, you have a 3.2-inch 2.1 million dot vari-angled touchscreen. It's basically the same thing that you're used to using. Still flips out, goes off to the side, doesn't get straight to the back of the body. Not something that they fixed. Really wish they would acknowledge this or put in one of those screens like Sony has done with their A9 III. That screen is far superior in terms of mobility, not in terms of quality. Sony screens are absolutely atrocious on the back of their cameras, so this is still good. I would just prefer that it got flush or did something different. Now, the R5 did not have a digital hot shoe, as most camera manufacturers didn't put those in till after the R5 came out. The R5 Mark II does have a digital hot shoe, and to protect it from the elements, it does have a locking weather seal type cap that clicks onto the top, just like the R1 has. You no longer have a micro HDMI port, it's now a full HDMI port, which is nice when you need to plug into it. You don't have to worry about something flopping out because the bigger one is better. Let me cut in here real quick and let you know that this video is brought to you by B&H and their Payboo credit card, where you pay the tax and B&H pays you back instantly for the same amount, which is kind of insane, but it actually does work. Now, I'm very selective when it comes to applying for new credit cards, but since I was making a $14,000 purchase at B&H, it was kind of a no-brainer to sign up and save a bunch of tax. Now, if you're wondering, I bought 36 new hard drives for a server that we're building here at the studio. Now, in fact, I applied right on B&H's website, and in minutes, I was checking out with my Payboo card. Now, there's two ways that you can save. One, you pay the tax and B&H pays you back instantly, or two, you get 12 months special financing on purchases of $599 or more. Now, like I said earlier, I personally chose to save the tax because in my recent purchase, I saved $818.64, and I'm saving tax on everything else that I order, from 4x5 film and chemicals for my baseball project to cameras, lenses, accessories, computers, TVs, and even doorbells. Whether you spend $10 or $10,000, those tax savings do add up. Now remember to always charge responsibly.
Low on cash, but still need to get your boo? Don't worry.
For more information and to apply for your Payboo card right now, head on over to the link that's on the screen or down below in the description. Now, in terms of the menu, it has been reorganized. And you'll notice when you're going through the different menus, they did put the name of each section up at the top inside the different color bars. That is a nice welcome change. And they also added a new olive color green, kind of weird, but that is for the custom control menu, where it used to be in the orange menu. It's now been moved to something that is olive. I probably would have come up with some different color other than olive because you already have green. What color that is, I don't know, but something other than that. The R5 Mark II still does feel really good in the hands, so the fact that they didn't change it that much isn't that big of a deal because it already felt good when you were shooting. There is a brand new 45 megapixel BSI stacked sensor. That's right, stacked. The R5 did not have a stacked sensor. So where does that fit in terms of the readout speed of the sensor? Well, the R5, when you would shoot moving subjects like golfers swinging or baseballs flying, you might end up with some bowing because it had a pretty slow readout speed when it came to using that electronic shutter. Well, Canon is telling us, and they didn't give us the exact number, they're saying that the R5 Mark II's readout speed is just ever so slightly slower than that of the R3. And yeah, the R3 shot 24 megapixels at 30 frames per second, and every once in a while, in the perfect condition, you might get slight bowing of something. It was very rare, but to say that it's fairly close to the readout speed of the R3 is pretty insane, especially knowing that this is 45 megapixels. Now, when I shot the golfer with the R1 and the R5 Mark II, it's honestly very difficult in the situation that I shot, in the swing that I captured, to see where there might be bowing, or is it just the curve of the club as the guy's swinging and it's just the force because there's always flex in the club? If it's that hard to tell, then that's a good sign that the readout speeds of both of these cameras are fast. Now, they're not going to match that of a global shutter because that is instant. Maybe one day we'll get there with Canon, but for now, only the A9 III is doing that. Now, to put it into perspective, the R3 has a flash sync speed of 1/180th of a second. Now, the R5 Mark II is 1/160th of a second. So it's just slightly slower. That should put it into perspective that it is fairly close to the same readout speed. Now let's move on to the ISO. You have native ISO of 100 to 51,200, and I tested all the way up to 8,000, and I'm able to open the raw files, and yes, at 8,000, this is what it looks like. You get some noise, you get some grain. That's typical at 8,000 ISO, but in better lighting situations, you're really not gonna see it be terribly bad. 5,000 was perfectly fine in the indoor situation for shooting sports. But what I can tell you is all the way back when we used the R5 for the real world review 4 years ago, I pushed that thing up to like 16,000 ISO in an art studio, and yeah, it had noise and it had grain, but it was totally usable. At 5,000 ISO shooting sports at a fast shutter speed, totally usable in my mind, and not as clean as what an R1 is gonna give you, of course, because less megapixels means larger pixels. Now let's move on to the autofocus, because the R5 Mark II has the same autofocus as the flagship R1. The only difference is that the R1 has cross-type sensors on the image sensor, and the R5 Mark II doesn't. But you're getting the same dual pixel AF version 2 with the accelerator, the Digic accelerator in there, which is basically giving you the AI processing. Canon doesn't call it that, but it does track subjects, and it is incredible. So incredible that you go into the new mode called Action Priority, and I'm in love with this mode. Why? Because it tracks balls, and I love balls. There's 3 different ball sports that it tracks as of right now. There's basketball, there's volleyball, and there's soccer. When I put it on for basketball, my mind was absolutely blown. It knows where the subject is going. It is predicting where the focus needs to go or where the ball is going to go based on the movements of the subjects. And in an action environment of basketball, it was finding the right subject before my brain could even compute that to get to where it needed to be. This is the best autofocus for both of these cameras on the market. It is so much better than the Z8, the Z9. It's better than the A9 III, which is the latest from Sony. This autofocus is far superior to anything on the market. Autofocus doesn't make a camera. Keep that in mind. But better autofocus, I'd rather have better autofocus than not, and have some other things be not as good. But autofocus is a main feature for me, and I think a lot of people out there. Moving on to page 2 of the notes, we've got frame rate. We are shooting at 30 frames per second with the electronic shutter in 14-bit RAW. The R5 did 20 frames per second in 12-bit RAW and was not stacked. You do get 12 frames per second still with a mechanical shutter. We're talking R3 speeds here at 45 megapixels. The Nikon Z9 can do 30 frames per second, but in JPEG only. The Sony A1 can do 30 frames per second, but this right here is doing 30 frames per second in 14-bit RAW. Now, what's weird is you can't dial it down from, say, you can't do 29, 28, 27, 26, but there are odd increments that you can go all the way down to 3 frames per second. I wish that I could dial it in any way that I chose. I'm not sure why they do that, but maybe in a firmware update they could do it. But R3 speeds in a 45 megapixel camera like this is pretty insane. The max shutter speed for electronic shutters is up from 1/8,000th of a second all the way now to 1/32,000th of a second. You have the same CF Express B card slot as well as an SD card slot, which is UHS 2 that the R5 had. Now you do have pre-shooting, just like the R1. Now what's different here, actually it's the same. The R1 gets a half a second and the R5 Mark II gets a half a second of pre-shooting, which means 15 frames are being buffered every time you hold the button halfway down. But what's interesting is you can't limit it to, say, 5 shots or 6 shots or a quarter of a second or a tenth of a second. Just like in the R1, you are forced to get 15 frames every time you have it active, which means when you take one picture, you're taking 16. Now, why is that an issue? Well, you have an SD card slot in this camera. I was shooting RAW plus JPEG large, and I outran that buffer really fast only because of the SD card slot. The CF Express B slot clears in a matter of seconds. The SD card slot, I was sitting there for like 20 to 25 seconds waiting for the light on the back of the camera to go off. That's how long it takes to do it. So if you're someone who shoots RAW, you might want to deactivate that SD card slot and it won't be redundant recording. Maybe just as a backup, you do JPEG larges to that because it can totally handle that. But if you're not a RAW shooter, I don't know why you wouldn't be a RAW shooter, but if you're not, you don't have to worry about it, but just keep that in mind, that SD card slot is super slow, especially when you fill that buffer. Let me jump in here real quick because I want to show you FROPAC 4 in action on this photo right here, taken with a Canon, starting with Blue's Clues, followed by Brooklyn, C41, Copper Tone, High C, Kaleidoscope, Mel Brooks, Saltwater Taffy, Thick, Tintype, and Wet Hot American Summer. But check this out, my all-time favorite from FROPAC 1 is Skittles. With one click of a button, we go boom. But check this out, exclusive and all new to FROPAC 4, we've got 4 custom adaptive Lightroom presets that include Face Enhance, Full Body Enhance, Eye Only Enhance, as well as Background Blur. So look, if you want to speed up your RAW workflow, give yourself a great starting point, or you're just tired of other people's presets sucking, ours don't suck. We've created 14 all-new custom Lightroom presets that you can check out right now at froknowsphoto.com/FROPAC4. While you're over there, you can play with the sliders to see the befores and the afters, and if you decide to pick them up right now, they are currently on sale. Or if you want to get the Grand Slam bundle that includes FROPAC 1, 2, 3, and 4, and of course Skittles, you will save even more. Now, let's get back to the video. Just like the R1, you have a new mode called People Priority Mode. That's like the people you want to prioritize in your life. You're like, yeah, I want you here, here. Fine, Steven, I'm gonna say it. It's just like MySpace, because you can have a top 10, which was top 8 plus 2. I said that joke in the other one. You probably already heard it. But face priority is pretty cool. I'll explain it right here as, say you're photographing a musician, and that musician likes to go into the crowd. Well, before the show, you took a picture of that musician, and you told the camera to prioritize that face when it sees face and IAF in a crowd. So if it sees that face sticking out, and it's kind of like if you had Where's Waldo. I wonder if it works on Where's Waldo for a book. Now we need to test that out. Get a Where's Waldo book. We don't have the camera. We're gonna test that out. We're gonna take a picture of Waldo and then see if it could find him in a book. In essence, that's what it's doing. It's prioritizing as long as it sees the face and the eyes. If they turn to the side, it's not gonna prioritize them. And if you put a second person in it and it can't find the first, it's gonna prioritize the second one. It just goes down the list, 1 through 10, and that's a pretty cool mode. Not sure how often you would use it, but if there is a specific person you always wanna capture, you would want to use this mode. Now, in terms of autofocus, you always have these different cases in the Canon cameras. Case 1, 2, 3, 4, and they were different for different sports, depending if someone was gonna be running across the screen or you didn't want it to get distracted by somebody getting in the way. Well, they've done away with the cases for all intent and purposes. There's really now just 2 options. One's auto, and one is where you can set it up yourself. So you can pick and choose what you want and save it into your own case. So they're kind of giving you the best of both worlds. I generally just leave it in the basic case at this point because the cameras are so good at doing this that I just leave it there and let the camera do its thing. Now, one head scratcher here in the R5 Mark II is that the R5 offered you pixel shift. That's where it would take multiple images and then stitch them together to give you a higher resolution, higher megapixel image. They took that out. But what they did add in here is a deep learning upscaling option, where from a JPEG or a RAW file that's converted in the camera to a JPEG, it will up-res it 4 times to 179 megapixels. I guess if you want to upscale something in the camera, you have that option. You could up-res it, you could then crop it and then send it out to someone. That's one of the features or one of the options you could use. It just takes a couple of seconds. It takes longer to up-res in the R5 Mark II than it does in the R1 because of the size of the files. And lastly, there's a weird option in there for percentage of your memory card that's left. You could turn this option on that it shows how many % of your card is left. I prefer to just have it turned on to how many shots I have left. I'd rather see the exact number than a percentage, but luckily that's something that you can turn off. It's really cool to see that the R5 Mark II got a lot of trickle down stuff from the R1, and that would lead me to believe that those specs are going to continue to trickle down into future lower-end Canon cameras. Now let's move on to the video features, because this is a stacked and loaded camera for stills. It's a stacked and loaded camera for video. Now, they've basically combined the R5C and the R5 to give you the R5 Mark II. They essentially combined the cinema video menu with the EOS stills menu. Now, that makes this a great B-cam option for people who are looking to not have R5Cs and go with something like this. And they also have the Cinema Q menu has been added to this camera. Let me cut in here real quick and say, would you like me to send you a free guide to capturing motion in low light situations? Well, if you said yes, just look for this orange box over on froknowsphoto.com, put your name, email address in it, hit send it. I'm going to send you that guide for free. And one of the biggest things, which honestly isn't a big deal for most other camera manufacturers at this point, is that they've done away with the 2959 limit. This is like one of the last holdouts to make that happen. In terms of video specs, we've got DCI 8K RAW up to 60p internally, which is up from 30p in the R5. There's now a new small RAW option that can shoot full width 4K RAW up to 60p. Just like the R5, you have DCI 4K up to 30p, which is oversampled from 8K. The camera now offers 2K and 1080 oversampled options from 4K up to 60. You also have 2K up to 240 frames per second for super slow mo. Keep in mind, I didn't have a ton of time with this camera and Steven wasn't there, so I don't have a lot of samples of all of these video options. As soon as we get a full-on production unit of this camera, we're probably gonna switch out to the R5 Mark IIs here. We've been using Canon R5s in the studio for 4 years now as our go-to video cameras and out in the wild. We're gonna replace those out with the R5 Mark II to get the newer specs and, you know, the tally light, because it has a tally light, and tally lights are very important when I'm like, are we recording? I could actually see the light, unlike with the R5 that we're using right now. One of the biggest issues with using Canon and shooting 120 frames per second slow-mo is that it baked it into a 30p file, and also it didn't give you audio. You now have unbaked file, 120, and you now have audio options to turn on, and you can still turn them off if you'd like. I will tell you that the video menu system was kind of weird, because when I wanted to switch from one video mode to another mode using the touchscreen, it would be like, well, you can't go here because this is enabled, or you need to disable this to do that. Why can't I just say I want to be in 8K or 4K, and then all those options come up and I can just touch what I want? Or why can't you just disable it when I do it? Hopefully that's something they can correct for with a firmware update. You can shoot in 10-bit 422 even when you're not in log. Now that's nice to have, because you don't always want to be shooting in log and you still want to get that higher quality. You do have the option of shooting in C-Log 2 up to 16 stops of dynamic range at this point. Now, something that came over from like the R7 is the auto leveling option that has been added to this camera. And for those of you who want to get higher bits when it comes to audio, you can do 24-bit 4-channel audio. And something new that no Canon EOS camera has had for video at this point are waveforms. They've added waveforms to this camera. So what does this camera cost? It comes in right around $4,000. This is an insanely stacked camera. You almost would think that if you put all of these features into a bigger body, you might consider this to be a flagship. It's pretty insane to think that. Now, the big question here is, if you have an R5, should you be upgrading to an R5 Mark II? If you're perfectly happy with your R5, the answer to that question is no. The R5 is going to be an extremely viable camera for years to come. It is a great camera any way you slice it, so if you can get one pretty inexpensive and you're just starting out, I don't know how you pass that up. Now, if you're gonna spend close to the price of this camera, then an R5 Mark II is going to be a great option. If you're an R3 sports shooter and you've wanted more megapixels, but you didn't want to skimp out on how many frames per second you could shoot, this might be a better choice for you than an R1, because you get 45 megapixels at 30 frames per second with a stacked sensor that's very similar to that of the speed readout of the R3. And you're getting all of that for less money than what an R1 would be. And you get the croppability for you people who love to crop. Who do I mean by you people? You people who like to crop. I don't like to crop, you like to crop. Look, this is an amazing catch-all camera. You're shooting weddings, whether it's stills or video, it's gonna be fantastic for that. You're shooting sports, you're shooting portraits, you're shooting landscapes, you're shooting wildlife. I mean, this is an insane camera. Personally, for me, I'm gonna use an R1 because that's what I want, but I wouldn't kick the R5 Mark II out of bed. And like I said, we'll be switching here in the studio to all R5 Mark IIs from the R5. If you haven't checked out the R1 hands-on preview at this point, go ahead and check that out as well. We thank you guys very much for watching. Jared, PolinPhotoPhoto.com. See ya.